Hi, I'm Mark. Thank you for watching and welcome to What in the World. Today, if you haven't already guessed it, we're going to be looking at the mystery of the Loch Ness Monster. So the Loch Ness Monster is a mystery that plays close to my heart. As a Scotsman, somebody that lives in Scotland, the idea that there's a lake just up the road with a dinosaur-like monster hiding in it was so appealing to me when I was younger, and I've long loved the mystery of Loch Ness Monster. So today what we're going to do is have a quick look at the facts, have a quick look at the myths, and see if we think the Loch Ness Monster is actually a real thing. So Loch Ness is a freshwater lake in the Scottish Highlands. It stretches about 23 miles long, but it's narrow and is often less than a mile wide. So what makes it unusual, it's not its surface, it's the depth. So to put this in perspective, Loch Ness is that deep that you could take the Statue of Liberty and submerge it in the loch and you would not see the torch peeking out the top. And it's 23 miles long. So we are dealing with a large volume of water, and dark water, may I add. If you were a would-be monster hunter and you decided to go swimming about in Loch Ness looking for the monster, you're going to have less than the distance between here and my hand to find the monster. So finding Nessie has always been extremely elusive. The lake is just that large and that deep that if the Loch Ness Monster was to swim casually past you, you might not notice. So let's start with the first encounter. So what the story says is that St. Columba was visiting Loch Ness in the 6th century, and as he was passing by the loch, he seen a swimmer being attacked by a monster. And what St. Columba did was he charged in and fought Nessie and saved the swimmer. Now, this is a truly fantastical account, and it's the first recorded account of the Loch Ness Monster. So, is there any truth in the story? Human beings tend to embellish. So, if we're looking at stories from the far-off past, what we tend to get is mythical, over-exaggerated stories of events that may have possibly happened. And in this case, is there any possibility that St. Columba was passing Loch Ness and seen some kind of aquatic animal attack a swimmer? I mean, it's very possible. There are a lot of creatures in Loch Ness, and we will look at that in this video. But are we to believe that St. Columba had the courage and conviction to take on a full-size plesiosaur to save a swimmer? And after this, Nessie does what she does best, and she goes into hiding. And there isn't a reported sighting that I can find of the Loch Ness Monster until the 1930s. So for between the 6th century and 1930s, the Loch Ness Monster pretty much didn't exist. There wasn't anyone speaking about it, there wasn't any recorded sightings on the lake, and if there was any activity, and if these things were being seen, then they weren't getting reported in any kind of a long-term historical record that we can go back and see. So in 1933, they built a new road which ran along the shoreline of Loch Ness. And what happened was people were driving along in their cars and people started to see the Loch Ness Monster in Loch Ness. So in 1933, there was all these reports in newspapers that started describing people seeing something in Loch Ness that had a long neck, it looked like it had humps, and it had a disturbance that didn't behave like a boat or a wave. So in 1934, we got our first piece of real evidence that Nessie was real. We got this famous photograph, known as the surgeon's photo. This photo shows Nessie very clearly sticking out of Loch Ness. And for most of my childhood and for most of my life, that was considered the gold standard proof of Loch Ness Monster's existence, because there really isn't a lot else available. However, unfortunately, the photograph turned out to be a hoax, guys. I'm sorry. So in the 1990s, it turned out that the monster was a small model attached to a toy submarine. The revelation damaged Nessie's credibility, but it didn't end the mystery. So in 1933, when they've introduced this road that runs along Loch Ness, you've got all these people driving along in their cars, they're looking out their window and they're seeing a plesiosaur, dinosaur, monster in the lake, and they're reporting this, and the tabloids are picking up on this, and they're reporting on it, and there's quite a lot of hype getting built up about this Loch Ness Monster. And if you're driving along Loch Ness on a clear day, you're seeing this big giant sheet of long thin glass, but you haven't really got much perspective on scale or size. So when you're looking at something on the loch, you can't tell if it's something that's really big or if it's something that's really small, because you haven't got the same depth perception. There was actual studies run on this where they got volunteers to sit and observe items going past them on the loch, and 5 minutes later were asked to describe what they seen, and they all give different accounts, and they all exaggerated slightly what they seen. So if you apply that effect to somebody driving along the road, think they see something at the corner of the eye, there's been stories in the tabloids that there's a monster in the loch, that's the first thing they're going to think of. They're going to think, I've just seen the Loch Ness Monster. So up to this point, what do we have? We've got St. Columbus had an encounter in the 6th century with the Loch Ness Monster. And then we get a spate of sightings of the monster in 1933 when they built the new road along Loch Ness. So the newspapers in the United Kingdom start reporting on the Loch Ness Monster being in the lake, and lo and behold, somebody goes up to Loch Ness and fakes a photograph of the monster. I mean, that's just classic human behaviour. But does it discredit completely the possibility of the existence of the Loch Ness Monster? Is there any possibility that the monster is real? Or are we looking at something that's just natural, that's been misinterpreted? So definitely, there's a lot of arguments that can debunk Nessie, but don't necessarily debunk it completely. So could it be boat wakes? If a boat's travelling along the lake, especially on a calm day, then that boat is going to leave a wave behind it. And that wave can travel for miles, and it can remain for hours. It can remain for absolutely hours on the loch. So that boat could be away miles and miles up the loch by the time you're walking past the point where you're seeing that wake. But you're not seeing any boat, you're just seeing a disturbance in the water. And if you already know of the story of the Loch Ness Monster, or if you've been hearing stories about the Loch Ness Monster, what's the first thing you're going to think that is? There are other animals on Loch Ness. You get seals, deers, otters, all kinds of wildlife that live at Loch Ness. So there is a small possibility that somebody walking along the lake could see one of these animals in the lake and easily misidentify it as some kind of monster. It's also very possible that the Loch Ness Monster is simply a misidentified aquatic animal. It could be another fish, it could be an eel, it just could be something that's really natural, but because of what I was saying about your perspective of looking at the lake and not really being able to truly grasp what you're seeing, it could be easily misidentified, especially if you already believe in the Loch Ness Monster. The last thing that could be misidentified as the Loch Ness Monster is logs. So there's lots of trees and forestry area around the loch, and if, like me, you live in Scotland, we get our fair share of rough weather. So quite often you will get lots of rains or we'll get torrential winds, and a lot of these trees get knocked down and put into the loch, and they'll drift along. And if you're at the side of the loch and you're looking and you see this big giant tree thing going past, you might well think that you've just had an encounter with the Loch Ness Monster. So not one thing that I've listed there conclusively rules out the existence of a monster. What it does show is that there's the potential for the monster to be misidentified, that it could be something natural. However, we still have not conclusively proved this yet. Now, because of the mystery of Loch Ness is one of the most explored lochs in the entire world. It's been scanned, it's been sonar tested, it's been DNA tested. They have conducted any possible scientific examination on this lake to try and determine if the monster is real. In 2003, the BBC conducted one of the most extensive sonar searches ever, but they found no evidence of the Loch Ness Monster. So more recently, scientists have been using something that's called eDNA sampling on the loch. And what this does is it tests the loch for all the genetic material, and it's able to tell it what kind of creatures and what kind of wildlife is living in the loch. So when they've tested it, They found DNA from fish, they found lots of bacteria and DNA from stuff that you would expect to find in the lake. But unfortunately, they didn't find any reptile DNA, they didn't find any dinosaur DNA. So we can rule out at this point that Nessie is probably a plesiosaur. Because in reality, if there was a plesiosaur living in Loch Ness, she would be leaving behind a genetic trace. She would be eating and, shedding scales and all this kind of stuff. There would be a DNA signature in the water that they would be able to detect. However, what they did say was they found an unusually large abundance of eel DNA. So when you look at Nessie, it's not a big stretch to think that if you cut her off at the head there, you've got kind of an eel shape. So as I referred to earlier in the video, Loch Ness is exceptionally deep, and at one point the loch was connected to the sea, but since the Ice Age it's now been landlocked, and Loch Ness is what we consider a freshwater loch, which means that there's no sea water getting into the loch, there's no salt water, which would exclude the possibility of this simply being a misidentified ocean animal, sea animal that somehow managed to swim into the lake. There isn't actually access into the loch anymore. Now, one theory that I read when I was younger was that there was massive tunnels that ran under the North Sea and up under Scotland, and these creatures were swimming through these tunnels and they were coming up and appearing in the loch. So anything that's going to be the size of a plesiosaur that's hiding in Loch Ness is going to be stationary there. It isn't something that's coming in from the outside. So we can rule out things like whales and sharks and large, big, massive sea beasts. So if you ever walk through the countryside or walk through like the Scottish Glens, you'll see these great big huge hills and coming down into big long deep valleys. Well, Loch Ness is literally one of those valleys filled with water. So it's not a stretch of the imagination to imagine that there is catacombs and there is tunnels and there is all kinds of networks of caves that run underneath the surrounding land. So is Nessie simply remaining elusive by hiding in these tunnels and these catacombs? I mean, it's not impossible. I can't rule it out completely. However, remember the DNA testing said that there was no dino DNA in the loch, but there was lots of eel DNA. So isn't it more possible? And this might be a little bit more unsettling than our nice friendly plesiosaur in the loch. But it could just be that those tunnels and catacombs are riddled with giant eels. And these giant eels, when they come out to feed or to mate, when they're seen on the loch, the way they swim through the water, there's your Loch Ness Monster. So that to me sounds a lot more believable than a giant plesiosaur that hasn't existed for millions of years, living in a catacomb underneath the glens in Loch Ness. Now, the thing about the Nessie story is it's not unique. It's not only in Loch Ness that we find a giant plesiosaur dinosaur style creature. No, there's reports of these creatures all over the world. Anywhere where you have a large body of inland water, there's usually a story of a giant monster inhabiting it. In the United States, in Lake Champlain, you've got Champ. You'll see Ogopogo in Lake Okanagan in Canada. There's also reports of a Nessie-style monster in Lake Van in Turkey, and there's also been sightings in Lake Tianqi in China. So what in the world's going on here? All these giant monsters being reported in lakes all over the world. Different cultures, different continents, same story. So are we dealing with a species of animal that exists that we're unaware of, that we've not been able to yet see and identify? Or are we dealing with something in the human condition? Is there something about the way that we interpret reality that's creating these? I think that maybe that's where we should focus our search. I think what's going on is possibly up here. I love the Loch Ness Monster, and I love the story of the Loch Ness Monster. And I would love to go to Loch Ness and actually see the Loch Ness Monster with my own eyes. However, in hundreds of years, humans have still not managed to capture anything that resembles proof of the Loch Ness Monster. And we live in the world of 2025 where drones and cameras, like nearly every inch of the planet's been photographed and looked at all the time. And if you look at this satellite image from Google Earth claiming to be the Loch Ness Monster, I had to admit, this one had me going for a little while, but it turns out that it actually is just a boat. So in the face of all the science that completely discredits that the Loch Ness Monster exists, why do people still believe in it? Why do I still kind of believe in it? If I was to walk along Loch Ness tomorrow on the night like this, I'd be terrified that that monster was going to peek its head out the water and look at me. So when we look to science for proof of Nessie's existence, unfortunately, the results came back conclusively that there is no plesiosaur living in Loch Ness or any kind of giant reptilian creature. So science doesn't back up the existence of Nessie either. Does it disprove the existence of Nessie? Well, no, but it shows that there isn't any scientific proof for its existence. And if we wanted to prove that any other creature was alive in Loch Ness, we were able to do that with the eDNA testing. So it does look strongly like there's no argument for a monster in Loch Ness, unfortunately. However, if you've ever seen a giant eel, I'm pretty sure that you would find that just as terrifying as a plesiosaur. So maybe there actually really is a monster in Loch Ness. It's a giant eel. So you can draw your own conclusions. You can decide for yourself based on the evidence whether you believe that Nessie's real or Nessie's not. But if you don't believe in Nessie, would you stand by that conviction enough to swim about in Loch Ness by yourself at night? I didn't think so. See you on the next episode, guys. Take care.